Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Look Up, the news and current affairs programme from Compass Media. Every week, myself, Finbar Markey, and my co-host Padraig O'Mweny look at news stories that either haven't got into the mainstream media, or on the other hand, maybe haven't had a fair hearing in the mainstream media. Thanks for joining us again this week, Padraig.
Happy to join you, Finbar, and happy to be in now the cold weather we're having at the minute.
Oh, it's bloody cold out there. It's like the first week in January and it coming on to the middle of March. But things seem to be hotting up in Ireland and around the world. There's a lot of news stories, there's a lot of discord. We're going to cover this discord, and inside of that coverage, we're going to try to have a balanced analytical discussion on these subjects rather than the extremes that we seem to be getting in the mainstream media these days. Padraig, one of the bigger stories this week in Irish news to start off is the eviction ban, and you want to lead with that story.
Yeah, so Finbar, I have a story here from the Irish Times. So housing campaigners have said the government's decision not to extend the eviction ban will result in higher levels of homelessness, while opposition parties have fiercely condemned the move. The leaders of the three government parties and Minister for Housing, Darragh O'Brien, decided not to extend the ban on evictions, meaning it will lapse at the end of March. The decision is likely to be approved by the Cabinet. The chief executive of Threshold, John Mark McCaffrey, said he understood the decision was a delicate balance and a difficult decision, but he said that ending the eviction ban in March will mean increased homelessness in the short term. We know there are a few options in the housing market for families and individuals who are threatened with termination. They're worried about losing their home, he said. The problem is there is very few places or nowhere for them to go in terms of the wider housing market. And we're also very much aware of the problems at local authority levels in terms of the emergency accommodation, which is the coin that's supposed to be the safety net where families and individuals turn to when there are no more housing options out there. And so I guess my question to government is, what can we advise people and families about these options? Mr. McCafferty acknowledged the ban stored up problems for the future and said it was not a panache. However, he said the situation would have been worse without it. The government is bracing itself for a storm of criticism in the wake of the decision. Sinn Féin housing spokesman Ona Breen said the ending of the ban was cruel and heartless. He warned that the move would increase homelessness, that the people who had to leave their rented accommodation would find that emergency accommodation was full. In most European countries, tenants who are up to date with their rent payments cannot be evicted. Ireland is in a unique position of having some of the highest rents in Europe and some of the lowest levels of protection for renters. Um, there is certainly a huge backlash on this. It's totally against the will of the people, Finbar. People want to see um, tax money diverted into social programs for the social good. They don't want to see government policy reflect the interests of vulture funds and private landlords. I do have some sympathy for the single house private landlords who may have invested in a certain manner based on government incentives in the past in a type of a pension type of scenario. But on the whole, this issue is all about creating profit where it shouldn't be. It should be societal good, has been raised before.
And isn't that what the government are trying to do now, especially Leo Varadkar and Micheál Martin, the leader of the two majority parties in the coalition? They're really trying to create division as much as possible, and they're trying to accuse principally Sinn Féin of being anti-landlord, and they're trying to get these individual or these one-off or second-off landlords, trying to get them in a supportive position for Fine Gael and for Fianna Fáil, and they're trying to create that division. The key question that was asked that you mentioned a minute or two ago was the question of where are these people who are going to be evicted? Where are they going to go? And this was the question that numerous Sinn Féin representatives principally were asking members of government in the Houses of the Oireachtas over the last few days. And the reply that they got didn't address that issue at all, other than into sheltered accommodation. But in terms of addressing it in a wholesome way, rather than address it, they made personal attacks and ad hominem attacks on the people asking that key question. The government were advised not to continue with the eviction ban. And remember, it wasn't a complete ban on evictions, by the way. It was a ban where people's circumstances or where landlords were moving on, things like that. So it wasn't a complete ban on evictions. But the principal advisor, legal advisor to the government, the Attorney General, is a landlord himself. And he was the one that gave advice to actually lift the ban and to allow evictions to go into a free fall or a cascade into the next coming weeks and months, if not years. And the Attorney General has a property portfolio, and this was highlighted by the Ditch, which is a very progressive journalistic enterprise here in Ireland that's really taken off lately. And several months ago, they highlighted the Attorney General's property portfolio. We have that headline here, actually. And so Attorney General, so Rossa Fanning owns Dublin 6 rentals worth about 1.5 million. Attorney General Rossa Fanning owns rental property portfolio worth 1.5 million. Government yesterday announced it would end the winter eviction ban following advice from Fanning. The Department of the Taoiseach wouldn't tell the Ditch if it was aware Fanning is a landlord before he advised him that an extension to the ban would come with a significant risk of a legal challenge. So it seems to be all interested parties. We know that there's a lot of government ministers and TDs who are landlords. The Attorney General has a property portfolio himself. There has been legal advice contrary to the Attorney General's advice, Rossa Fanning's advice on this. Rossa Fanning is well known for representing banking things and what are known as vulture funds, so things like KBC Bank in high-profile cases in the past. So it would appear we know where his historical experience and interests lie. We know where his personal financial interests lie, or at least some of them. And he's giving this advice, and he should essentially recuse himself because he is so constrained by conflicts of interest in this matter. What do you think about Rossa Fanning giving this advice as Attorney General, Paul?
I fully agree with him, Merle. If somebody in a position of such authority as an advisor to government on legal matters is himself in a position where he can't really declare to be free of conflict of interest, then surely the question should be asked of somebody else who isn't in that position. It's a situation that shouldn't arise.
And Cork TD Mick Barry made some statements at a protest, I believe, where he was calling for people to, not at a protest, I think it was in the door, my apologies, where he was calling for people to ignore eviction orders and to stay in their homes, essentially. We'll have a look at that video now.
I would say to any renter who faces an eviction, and it's an eviction into homelessness, don't just walk away from your property. Don't just walk away into homelessness. Stand your ground. Refuse to go. You can overhold. And there will be people who fight for workers' rights, fight for the rights of renters, who will be prepared to support you. I know that's not an easy decision for anyone to take, but anyone who weighs things up and makes that decision themselves, they will have support. All right? This is an extreme decision, a reckless decision, and needs to be opposed in this place and out there in society as well. And it's better to break the law than to break the poor. And what's being proposed here is something that will break the backs of many poor families who are struggling in this country. It's an outrageous decision.
So that was Mick Barry at Cork TD on the issue of the eviction ban and giving some very strong advice to homeowners, or sorry, to renters to stay in their homes. And I really hope and expect that if people are to follow that advice, that he's going to provide them with supports while they're doing that, because it's a very, very nerve-wracking thing to ask anybody to do, to stay in a home where their landlord has maybe sought and got an eviction order against them. Staying in Cork, there were opposing protests with regards to asylum seekers and refugees in Cork last weekend. Do you want to run with this, Padraig?
Yeah, so Finbar, it's something we've been covering each week because it's a major societal issue. So we'll continue when we see something that people would want to be updated on. So the housing crisis has given oxygen to the anti-immigrant movement, says Cork TD. So Gardaí were forced to intervene as hundreds of people gathered in Cork city centre last Saturday for two separate demonstrations, which led to minor altercations between the two groups. A number of people gathered at the National Monument on the Grand Parade at noon for a demonstration labelled Cork Says No to Racism, while a smaller group of anti-migrant protesters assembled nearby. I think that the government are giving the anti-refugee movement a supply of oxygen by failing to tackle the housing crisis and failing to genuinely provide housing for all, TD McBarry said. So I think opposing the racists and fascists, as was done in Cork, is one part of an anti-racist strategy. And I think strongly opposing the government on housing is another part. Around 700 people are estimated to have attended both demonstrations, which were scheduled for the same time in roughly the same place. The Cork Says No to Racism group carried banners calling for an end to direct provision and welcoming refugees to the city. Attendees described the atmosphere at the gathering as friendly and welcoming, with musicians and entertainers performing for the crowd. The anti-migrant group gathered outside the city library, carrying banners with slogans saying, "Cork says no and house the Irish, not the world." The demonstration included speakers from the East Wall Says No group in Dublin, as well as several people carrying flags and banners on behalf of the right-wing National Party. Those in attendance say just before 1 p.m, a number of people from the anti-migrant group broke off with the rest and went to confront members of the larger anti-racism group. Gardaí intervened and were able to separate the two groups, and both sets of protesters continued with their demonstrations. Gardaí say that no arrests were made. So yeah, basically that is just a rundown on what the Examiner said when they were covering it. So I think you have a video there which might give another little bit of context as well, and maybe encapsulate what happened on the day.
Okay, so that was a video from Cork of these rival protests that are happening and that have occurred in Dublin as well to a degree. I do know that the East Wall Protest Committee or the Dublin Protest Committee that are organising protests against mass immigration or the placement of asylum seeker and refugee centres in their local communities, that there was a major anti-racism protest in Dublin a few weeks ago, and there was another counter-protest organised where the likes of Tommy Robinson, I believe, were supposed to appear. And the Dublin Protest Committee put out a statement maybe a day or two beforehand saying that they had nothing to do with that counter-protest, that they don't believe in counter-protests, and that they want to have no association with Tommy Robinson. So we can see that even there is a split between extremist right-wingers that are starting to emerge, with the likes of Tommy Robinson coming over here and the Nationalist Party, who, let's be clear, are right wing, and I don't think that they in any way try to hide it at all. When I say right wing, I believe would be rather inhumane in their beliefs about people from other countries, other cultures, things like that. So this kind of stuff is happening. We're going to keep on watching it. Borg, what is your take on it, standing on the outside looking in at these groups of what seem to be rather extremes on both sides, the extreme left, the extreme right, standing off with each other on the streets of Ireland?
Well, I think that we do need to oppose discriminatory rhetoric when it comes. How we do that should be considered in terms of impact. Like, we should oppose them, and we should take a stand. I don't know if counter protests do that or if they make something bigger out of it. the far right narrative at the moment is pretty much operating in an echo chamber. They're more or less talking to a small group of people, and they're more or less talking to themselves. Genuine, normal people aren't discriminatory by nature, so they're not going to be won over by the type of sensational things that some of them are saying, which are kind of off the wall, that there's a replacement program going on, stuff like that. That there certainly isn't, and it breeds into hate and stuff like that. So ordinary people have no interest in it, but then maybe you have to ask the question, if we're bringing, if we're going to have counter protests all the time, are we creating a rally call for them to grow? Surely it has to be considered a little bit more. So I just don't know. I don't know what it really achieves, other than to maybe create news.
Yeah, and maybe staying in the theme of conservative, liberal, social issues for another minute or two. The Irish Muslim Council this week put out a statement saying that they are not in agreement with what appear to be plans for sex education in Ireland to be expanded greatly to address trans issues in primary schools and things like that. The Irish Catholic Council, Schools Council, issued a statement earlier this week outlining their distaste at such developments, and they have now been followed by the Irish Muslim Council as well. We'll just bring this statement up here. Just to read what they've said, gender identity education in primary schools. The Irish Muslim Council supports the position of the Catholic Primary Schools Management Association about the teaching of gender identity issues in primary schools. The Irish Muslim Council believes it is not appropriate to teach primary school children such a complex and contested topic, particularly when there is a lack of scientific consensus about the way to treat children with gender dysphoria. The Irish Muslim Council believes every child in primary school should be supported, respected, and treated with consideration. We think it is unacceptable to treat children about gender identity under the pretext of teaching them about diversity. Sayak Dr. Umar Al-Quadri, chair of the Irish Muslim Council, says the Taoiseach should focus on solving the health crisis, the housing crisis, and the many other challenges we face as a nation. The Irish Muslim Council shares the concerns of the CSPMA and believes it is not appropriate to cover this topic in primary schools. The number of children in Ireland who are questioning their gender identity is increasing, but so too is the number of detransitioners who regret steps they took to socially, medically, and surgically transition. We believe the topic of gender identity should be dealt with the utmost of caution, particularly when it comes to children. So that was the Irish Muslim Council. It sounds reasonable enough what they're saying. What's your opinion on that, Padraig?
Yeah, I think it is reasonable, the position that they're setting out. Just as it's reasonable for people to have reservations, if not a little bit of difficulty understanding what the initiative really is about, because you've got to base these things on data. Opinion doesn't go far enough. So let's base it on data. So what are the studies that have been performed to show that this is an area that we need to address? What is the impact of not addressing it? What has been the societal impact over generations of not having this education in place? Let's do a study on that. Let's do a study then on where it has been brought in different countries maybe, and look at the impact that it's had. And let's talk about that and inform the conversation a little bit more, rather than just going on opinions. Because to me, obviously, we've all come through the education system. Did we feel like it was a major disadvantage not to have that education? I don't feel like it disadvantaged me. I have a very liberal outlook to how people want to live their lives. So what's the difficulty? I can't speak for everybody, I can speak from personal experience, but as a father with children, I don't feel comfortable with bringing conversations in at a childhood level that arguably don't need to be had. Now, convince me otherwise. If you're going to do that, then convince me with data and studies.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, Padraig. And I think one concern for me is that these things are not being discussed in a proper way, with proper depth, without name calling, without ad hominem attacks on people who are presenting one side or the other. Rather than a balanced debate happening, there seems to be positions being taken within the media and within the state, and rather extreme positions, which again results in the debate becoming extreme rather than it being a sensitive debate where people can express themselves and their concerns and come to some kind of middle ground on things. As an example, maybe some children who are pre-secondary schools or who are still in primary school, maybe they do display signs of gender dysphoria. And in those circumstances, let the school be aware of that and give the child supports. But children are very malleable in terms of how they think and their mind. And children sometimes will latch on to things. And to have a process where the start of transitioning begins pre-primary school, that would be a concern to me, the idea that children would latch on to this and maybe start demanding that at that such an early stage when their mind is like a sponge and takes in everything and sometimes manipulates things and attaches their understanding egotistically or egocentrically to themselves. And that is a concern that I think is expressed in what the Muslim Council have said, what the Catholic organization said, and a lot of parents have expressed to me as well. Any thoughts on that, Patrick?
Yeah, well, like those advocating to bring this change into the education system, will they be there to support people who feel later on that it was a wrong decision? Like, is this only in one direction, this initiative? Like, so really, I think we need to look at this in the longer term, and as I said, we certainly need to base it on more facts. So let's see that, like, let's develop it. Like, in a democracy, we should certainly be discussing every issue, and everybody should be heard at these issues, and they shouldn't be shut down because they have maybe got a Catholic rigid sort of Christian outlook, or indeed like a conservative Muslim outlook or whatever. Everybody's voices needs to be heard because ultimately they're parents.
Yeah. And a subject that maybe didn't have a balanced discussion and debate over the last few years is the matter of COVID. And it looks like there's a lot of information coming out now, a lot of admissions happening in terms of errors, mistakes, pretenses of following the science, and maybe the science wasn't actually followed, or where the science results were manipulated or exaggerated, things like that. So that seems to be coming out. And one of the principal places it's coming out is in the UK. You wanted to run, first of all, with these Telegraph headlines, Porter.
Yeah, so the Telegraph in England carried the story, which was around the leaked WhatsApp messages, which revealed how the British Health Secretary hoped to shock the British public into complying with ever-changing lockdown rules. Throughout the course of the pandemic, officials and ministers wrestled with how to ensure the public complied with ever-changing lockdown rules. One weapon in their arsenal was fear. We frightened the pants off everyone, Matt Hancock suggested during one WhatsApp message with his media advisor. The then Health Secretary was not alone in his desire to scare the public into compliance. The WhatsApp message seen by the Telegraph show how several members of Mr. Hancock's team engaged in a kind of Project Fear in which they spoke of how to utilise fear and guilt to make people obey lockdown. In a WhatsApp group called MH Top Team that involved a number of advisors and civil servants, one advisor, Damon Poole, who was Health Secretary Matt Hancock's media advisor, said that failing to publish data can be turned to their advantage because it helps the narrative that things are really, really bad. Boris Johnson, the then British Prime Minister, had promised that families would be reunited at Christmas, the first since the pandemic struck in early 2020. He said foregoing long-awaited reunions would be inhumane and against the instincts of many people in the country. But behind the scenes, his ministers and officials were increasingly aware that vast swaths of the public faced a grave disappointment and that the Johnson administration would take the blame for their frustration. The solution in December was to frighten the pants off everyone with a declaration of a new strain of COVID-19 known as the Alpha or Kent variant. In the conversation between Mr. Hancock and Mr. Poole on December the 13th, the pair discussed how to survive the coming backlash and storm. On the day, there were 18,409 cases of COVID recorded with 410 deaths. 5 days later, on December the 18th, Mr. Johnson would scrap his planned 5-day Christmas amnesty in About Turn. The conversation started with a discussion about a fear that Sadiq Khan, the London Lord Mayor, would attack the government for plunging the capital into its own lockdown, just as Andy Burnham, the mayor of Greater Manchester, had waged a battle in his city a few days earlier. So really, the shocking stuff here is, okay, we were in a health emergency, and this is looking across the water, but it was shared in terms of the impact. It didn't matter about borders or seas. It was something that was happening concurrently in different places. And there was conversations going on in a private capacity, in a private social media group, and they discussed bringing fear in, implementing fear to influence how people acted. They even discussed bringing in, which sounds like bringing in new variants into the media quickly. Now, not suggesting these are made up variants, that they did exist, that they were coming from regions that they were identified in, but that they wanted to bring them in quickly to influence public opinion. At times, they even said, let's not share all the data because it goes against their intentions, which were to influence public opinion based on fear. So this is out of order, totally out of order. We know it happened most places. This is how people were controlled. It happened certainly in Ireland to a large extent. We've seen an awful lot of this come out in the public last week with former NEFIT member Martin Cormican exposing this and showing that an awful lot of the follow the science elements were not based on science, they weren't based on fact. And we see here now again. So I think it's of huge relevance to Ireland, what was happening within the British system, given that the British system extends in jurisdiction into Ireland as well.
I think a number of British MPs, and I think possibly even what we would call senators, were Lords in the House of Lords, have been censured for raising matters like this, but it's still breaking through, and there are still MPs out there that are raising these issues. We have a video of one such MP now.
Mr. Speaker, the families of the 43,000 care home residents who lost their lives will be appalled at the former Health Secretary attempting to rewrite history, an attempt that will turn to ashes along with his TV career. We need more humility and less celebrity from the member for West Suffolk, and above all, we need answers. Mr. Speaker, throughout the COVID pandemic, ministers repeatedly claimed they threw a protective ring around England's care homes and always followed the evidence and scientific advice. But WhatsApp messages from the former Health Secretary revealed in today's Telegraph suggest nothing could be further from the truth. Can the Minister now confirm that the Chief Medical Officer first advised the government to test all residents going into care homes in early April 2020? Can she explain why the former Health Secretary rejected this advice and failed to introduce community testing until the 14th of August, a staggering 4 months later? Can she publish the evidence that following the advice would have muddied the waters, as the member for West Suffolk claimed? And can she confirm that 17,678 people died of COVID in care homes between the CMO's advice and the government finally deciding to act? She should know, Mr. Speaker, because she was responsible for care homes at the time. Now, former ministers are touring the studios this morning, claiming this delay was simply because there weren't enough tests. Where is the evidence for this? And even if tests were in short supply, why weren't care home residents prioritised when the devastating impact of COVID was there for all to see? Now, Mr. Speaker, nobody denies that dealing with COVID was unbelievably difficult, especially in the early days. But care home residents and staff were simply not a priority. Yet the former Prime Minister and Health Secretary were first warned about the emerging horror in care homes by my honourable friend, the member for Hove, in March 2020. I myself raised the lack of testing in care homes with the Health Secretary. On the 8th of April, the 28th of April, the 19th of May and the 17th of June, long before the CMO's advice was finally followed. The Minister will no doubt say all these issues will be looked at in the public inquiry, but the findings from this won't be available for years. Mr. Speaker, the families of the 43,000 care home residents who lost their lives will be appalled at the former Health Secretary attempting to rewrite history, an attempt that will turn to ashes along with his TV career. We need more humility and less celebrity from the member for West Suffolk, and above all, we need answers.
So that was in the British Houses of Parliament this week. Padraig, you just wanted to talk a little bit about that?
Well, Finbar, as it may seem benign to think that the impact of this was just to lock people down. And sure, you might equate that with, well, sure, that doesn't cause harm, but it caused huge harm because people were in care homes and they died without seeing their family again. This had huge impact, and indeed, like there's a huge question as well, as was described there, around testing and how long it took for Matt Hancock to actually direct that testing had to be done in the care home. So in Ireland, it was very apparent. It was apparent very early on, and it was raised by Father Tobin that we needed an inquest into what's going on in the care homes, because the huge amount of deaths that occurred in COVID was really concentrated hugely in care homes. So huge public inquiry needs to happen there, and need to find out in terms of testing, because that's where the deaths were being racked up. So these things are all extremely revealing of a time in history where people really did just delegate trust to the authorities, and it doesn't look like it was trust that was well founded, because what's coming out now, it shows that there was huge amount of reasons we shouldn't have trusted them.
No. We have a video just in terms of factuality and things coming out in trust. I have a video now of Dr. Redfield, who was is the former head of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the United States. He was the head of it just as the whole COVID thing broke out. He was sidelined because he believed that COVID came from a lab in Wuhan, in China, a lab that was being paid by the United States to conduct experimental work that the United States had banned in its own country. And he has made a statement over the last week outlining a number of events that occurred in the Wuhan lab, which have led him to be pretty concrete sure that there was an escape of something from that lab. We'll have a look at this video. We'll come back to you in a minute.
That I will say, if you go back and look, it's declassified now, and I'm sure you'll all have your classified briefings, but the declassified information now, in September of 2019, 3 things happened in that lab. One is they deleted the sequences. It was highly irregular. So researchers don't usually like to do that. Second thing they did was they changed the command and control of the lab from the civilian control to the military control. Highly unusual, and I've been involved in dual-use labs when I was in the military. And the third things they did, which I think is really telling, is they let a contractor redo the ventilation system in that laboratory. So I think clearly there was strong evidence that there was a significant event that happened in that laboratory in September. It's now been declassified. You can read it. I'm sure there's more classified information around.
Okay, so that was Dr. Redfield, former head of the CDC, Center of Disease Control in the United States. We have one more video, which is of Dr. Margaret Chan, former head of the World Health Organization herself, and she's talking about how private donations and donors influence 70% of the funding and the work of the World Health Organization, and that whoever makes these donations are the people who decide what the focus and the work of the World Health Organization is. We'll have a look at this quick video and we'll be back to you.
You asked an excellent question. If I tell you, WHO as an organization, only 30% of my budget is predictable funds. Other 70% I have to take ahead and go around the world to beg for money. And when they give us the money, they are highly linked to their preferences, what they like.
That was Margaret Chan, former head of the World Health Organization. What do you make of those videos, both the CDC, former head of the CDC, Dr. Redfield, and Margaret Chan, the revelations that are coming out, linking that to earlier videos we showed of the British MP asking questions?
Conflict of interest obviously is demonstrated there. First of all, the question of lab leak or not, what that exposes is that the media censorship is a very real and extreme thing. That was considered a conspiracy theory, and anybody talking about it was considered mad. That's been shown to be out of order, because this question it's extremely plausible that it could have come from there. There's been an awful lot of questions around that have revealed how quite possible that is. Like, and I'm not suggesting it is or isn't, I don't know, but it's definitely possible, and it shouldn't have been censored to that degree. In terms of the WHO, well, look, conflict of interest with funding, it's the same as the issue around war. If those who are benefiting from the arms industry are also heavily represented in their relationships with senior figures in governments, it's the same issue if you have a pandemic and senior figures in pharmaceutical companies are major donors to the policy making body, which really will, if it didn't dictate the last time, and it had a huge influence, everybody in governments across the world listened to what the WHO directives were. Well, out the far side of the WHO pandemic treaty, when if that is ratified, it will actually be a derogation of sovereignty to that body. And if the conflict of interest exists, that huge pharmaceutical companies are having a say, but that can't exist in the same place and be fair and transparent.
Yeah, we're going to watch that space both with the WHO pandemic treaty, as it's been called, and also developments about further information coming out on what happened over the last few years with COVID and the factuality of what we were told. We're going to stick with kind of international news. In Georgia, there have been what's been described by mainstream corporate media in the so-called West as peaceful protests against a law or a draft law which would have required agencies and organizations within Georgia to register if they receive more than 20% of their funding from outside of the state. The United States has had a similar law in place for scores of years, a stricter law, in fact, registering foreign agents. And this is kind of the same thing, really. It's just trying to identify those types of organizations that might be trying to influence political debate in the country. We were told that these were peaceful protests, but clearly they weren't peaceful protests. There were riots. People came prepared for riots. There are elements within the relatively small crowds. I don't think when I looked at the aerial views that there was that many people in the square in Tbilisi in Georgia. But it really is reminiscent of what the US funded organizations and the Soros type funded organizations did in Kiev in 2013-14 when they weren't getting their way there. Let's have a look at these two videos and we'll come back to you in a minute. So that's two videos from the streets of Tbilisi in what we are being told were peaceful demonstrations, but where people were building barricades, clearly from the videos, and they had come dressed and prepared for trouble. Any opinion or take on what developments are in Georgia at the moment, Padraig?
Well, a country that has recent history of conflict with Russia, in a similar way, based on issues with NATO expansionism, any type of civil unrest and turmoil in areas like that are going to be suspect at the moment as agitation towards maybe a wider issue in the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia. I don't know enough about it to give you a clear view on what is actually going on there, but I'd be skeptically looking at it to have a look and see what are the drivers behind these things. So just watching on with interest for now from there.
You'd really wonder if the people of Georgia are really that concerned about protecting organizations whose more than 20% of their funding comes from outside of the state, that they would actually get out and riot. And this seems to be a clique of those organizations who have been prepared, in my mind, to actually do this at some stage to destabilize the government. Sticking with the idea or the notion of geopolitical imperialism that's happening around the world, the Mexican president over the last week made a speech with regards to US interference in other countries and the democracy within the United States compared to the democracy within Mexico. I think this is an interesting clip in the context that a US Republican member of Congress in January put a proposal for the US to militarily intervene in Mexico under the guise of going in there to try to deal with drug cartels. We'll have a look at this video and we'll come back.
Está como aprovecho para contestarle al Departamento de Estado del gobierno de Estados Unidos, que como es la mala costumbre, siempre se inmiscuyen en asuntos que no les corresponden. Muy contrario a lo que piensa el presidente Biden, que siempre habla de igualdad, textualmente de un pie de igualdad, pero todavía no abandonan la política de hace 2 siglos, la política de Monroe, de sentirse el gobierno del mundo. ¿Qué le digo con todo respeto al señor Blinken del Departamento de Estado? Que hay más democracia actualmente en México que en Estados Unidos. Y que en vez de estarse metiendo, actuando de manera injerencista en nuestros asuntos, si quieren seguir con la misma política, pues que se ocupen de lo que está pasando en el Perú, donde ahí la embajadora de Estados Unidos es la asesora de los golpistas que pisotearon las libertades y la democracia en ese país, destituyendo injustamente al presidente y encarcelándolo. Y que le hagan caso al presidente Biden. Pero esto no es nada más el Departamento de Estado, es la naturaleza, cuando menos la costumbre que viene de siglos en el gobierno de Estados Unidos y en las élites de Estados Unidos. Cuando hablo de que tenemos más democracia nosotros que ellos, es porque aquí gobierna el pueblo, allá gobierna la oligarquía. Nada más, ayer, por ejemplo, el periódico posiblemente más influyente en términos económicos y financieros en el mundo, el Wall Street Journal, 8 columnas y fotografía para la marcha de los corruptos. Porque este periódico y otros en Estados Unidos protegen a las mafias de poder económico en el mundo. Está mejor el Reforma. Bueno, pues ya.
So that was the Mexican President Obrador talking about US interference. And this is in the context of a time when the US actually, at least there's a motion down to the houses of Congress in the United States to be discussed about interfering militarily in the domestic affairs of Mexico itself. This is just another example, Padraig, isn't it? Whether it's Georgia, Ukraine, Mexico, another example of the United States trying to just control everything around the world.
Yeah, well, there's clearly two. In the past, we've seen obviously with the British for centuries and centuries, but there's currently two outliers in terms of militaristic overreach in the US and Israel in their interests in sovereign nations and where they feel they can go to exercise those interests. And you have to be skeptical about when reasons come up which gives them what they believe is a reasonable authority to go into these places. They're certainly outliers, and they have to be called to account. They have to be brought in from these positions where they really do act like they can do what they want. And there's always a reason, isn't there? And there's always the words war are usually in there to justify anything, whether it be a war on drugs or whether it be a war of regime change where they believe they are bringing democracy to the world. And it's interesting that the word democracy comes up there, because how democratic is the US? Like it doesn't seem to be the standard for democracy in my view.
And it's not just the United States either, it's Europeans as well. Your man Borrell, who is essentially the foreign minister for the EU, they give him some fancy name, but he's the foreign minister for the EU. He was talking about this, that Europe is a garden and everywhere else is a jungle, and that the Europeans have to tame the jungle, stuff like this, real colonial language. The former head of the Bundestag in Germany was in Namibia recently and was in front of camera talking to the Namibian president and started to complain about the amount of Chinese people in Namibia compared to the amount of German people. And he got quite a rebuke back from the Namibian president. And this seems to be another theme that's developing, where Africa is no longer being dragged along by the United States dominance and narrative and hegemony and everything. And a lot of Africa seems to be standing up for itself and even aligning itself with alternatives now. Let's have a look at this video.
Whereas in Namibia, for example, the number of Chinese people living here in the meantime is 4 times as much as, for example, the German community. And insofar, it's not precisely the same what takes place all over the world. There are differences. And what I'm...
Mr. Speaker, yeah. What is your problem with that? Why does it become your problem? It looks like it's a more European problem than our problem. Yeah. You are so sorry for us. I don't see... Chinese will never come and play around here. As Germans not allowed to do that. Which Germans are doing, by the way. You talk about Chinese. We allow Germans to come offer visas here. Red carpet. Our people are harassed in Germany. Even diplomatic passport holders in Germany. And you come in here, Germans come in here as they want. So why Chinese talk about Germans? How you are treating us there? Chinese don't treat us like that. Diplomatic passport holders. We're coming to our own country. Don't be sorry for us.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Every time Westerner comes, it's about Chinese.
So that's the former head of the Bundestag and the president of Namibia having a little bit of a clash. Again, it's the colonial question being challenged. Maybe we are only now moving into the real time of post-colonialism, where Africa and other countries just ain't taking it anymore. We're going to move on, if you don't mind, Padraig, pretty quick because we're stuck for time. Just looking at Ukraine now, AP news agency, which is an American news agency, put out a program looking at different issues and military issues and domestic issues in Ukraine. And he also covered these squads or teams that go around arresting dissenters in Ukrainian held areas. So this is arresting people who may have put something up on Facebook or Twitter criticizing the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainian army. Let's have a look at this video and we'll come back to you.
Куда выходим? Выходим. Куда пошел? Выходи сюда. Выходим. Там женщина. Тут бабушка. Тут бабушка. Кто еще мужчина? Сюда выходите. А мужчина, успокойтесь. Ребята, успокойтесь совсем.
Все хорошо. Все, зафиксировал, можешь посмотреть.
Посмотри
на меня.
Поддерживал.
Смотри на меня внимательно.
Но я теперь уже не...
Это читай.
Ну, я поддерживал много, да.
Ты поддерживал Путина, да, и поддерживаешь армию России. Как-то ты не хорошо о флаге Украины, да, отзываешься? Да?
Извините. Ну да, это много ставил, я вам говорил. Ну, я уже это даже передумал все это.
Сегодня, да? После нашего прихода,
сейчас,
да?
Ну,
Прямо сейчас, да?
Ну, понятно.
Да? Так, собираем вещи, одеваемся. Собирай вещи, одевайся.
А що буде?
Нічого не буде.
А куди мене?
Все буде відповідно чинного законодавства України.
Нет денег на лекарства.
Не знаешь ничего.
Ну, не надо там бить.
Конечно, никто тебя не будет. Все, мы ж не расшли. Обулся? Все, погнали. Забери его.
Приду домой. Пожалуйста.
Не-не-не, не беру. Не, все по закону, он будет, все с ним будет хорошо. Садись.
Дуже швидкий темп задають наші Збройні Сили, ми мусимо їм відповідати і надавати інформацію і працювати так, щоб їм не били в спину.
Відповідальність за колаборацію невідворотня. Завтра чи післязавтра це питання.
Okay, so that was the AP news agency that put that out. I'm not sure if they had an opinion really on what was happening in that video. It is pretty scary, and it's scarier when you add to it that countries like the United Kingdom certainly and definitely now see themselves as party, a direct party to this war. And so the head of the chair of the Defence Committee in the UK has actually called for direct involvement of the UK in Ukraine. Let's have a look at this video.
We are now at war in Europe. We need to move to a war footing. We are involved in that. We've mobilized our procurement processes. We're gifting equipment. We need to face Russia directly and rather than leaving Ukraine to do all the work.
That's the chair of the Defence Committee, Tobias Elwood, calling for direct involvement by the UK. And what are we going to see? Are we going to see these squads and teams that we saw in the previous video arresting dissenters? Is that what we're going to see in the UK and possibly in Ireland and other EU countries if we get involved? We know that Germany is charging people and bringing people to court for questioning the narrative on this war already. What's your take on developments there, Padraig?
They will have different techniques for different populations and demographics and how their cultures are like. So in places like Ireland and England, I can't see people being lifted in manners like that, not unless there's a serious change over a period of time. But you know, it is remarkable, like when you see these things, and you know, even in terms of these governments being directly involved and still at the same time claim that there is no proxy war and that this is a war between imperialist Russia and Ukraine who are in a defensive strategy. Like it doesn't stand up. There's two imperial powers in this, I suppose, between Russia and the US is the biggest one on the other side, but all those complicit in it are the other members of NATO, really. And these governments from time to time assert themselves as if they're puffing their chest out to say we are here, we have something to say on this, and that defies then their cries, which try and characterize the whole thing as Russian aggression.
EU, UK and US politicians and internal unelected leaders within the military are talking definitely about a direct war with Russia, direct war with China, especially China. So I never thought we'd be here a couple of years ago. Who knows where we're going to be, even at a domestic level, in the next 12 months to 24 months. So it's all very worrying, and I wouldn't discount any developments such as those squads on our own streets in the next few years. And we need to really get a handle on what's happening, and somebody with a bit of common sense needs to take control. You wanted to lead, and this sums up this overall subject matter, I suppose. You wanted to lead with a headline and some discussion on imperialism itself, Padraig.
Yeah, Finbar, so something that many of us we've come from a left identifying background myself, so it's not an exclusively right-wing thing to be skeptical of the construct of the EU. In fact, the left-wing skepticism of it probably predates it. So this is something that Lloyd categorizes as economic imperialism. I just want to give an example of it. So the EU is advising governments to end the blanket energy supports like the €200 electricity credit by 2024 and start paying down high national debts. The time for fiscal largesse has passed, according to the Commission's economy chiefs, who warned that continuing subsidies could feed into higher prices. Energy subsidies, excise reductions and other supports cost EU countries an estimated 1.2% of GDP last year, but could have been a quarter of the cost had they been more targeted. This support cannot continue indefinitely, said European Commission Vice President and Trade Chief Valdis Dombrovskis. As energy prices head lower, we should move to phasing out most of the support measures, starting with the least targeted. The time for broad-based fiscal stimulus has passed. A former Latvian Prime Minister said, the better than expected economic picture should allow governments to stop spending while also investing in much needed green and digital infrastructure. While the EU believes inflation has peaked, he warned that continued giveaway budgets could push prices higher and we may end up in a situation where the European Central Bank is forced to tighten monetary policy even further. So my issue with this is there's people ordinary working people who are carrying the burden of the financial restrictions that have come in on the back of the energy crisis and the war. And as we've talked about on various other subjects, we have the issue of movement of people across borders, which is creating real pressure on social systems such as housing, accommodation, rent, all these extended problems that occur. And now the EU is passing dictates out to other governments and into sovereign jurisdictions where they are trying to say that you shouldn't give some concessions to people who are in financial difficulties in terms of energy in this case.
In the reality, Padraig, the EU have been doing that for years and years now. And to create these economic crises, we give away more sovereignty for loans and for bailouts. And the result is that they dictate all of our economic policies. And there's only a pretense that they don't. In Europe, people are starting to stand up to this. There seems to be an EU-wide dictate about pensions and raising the pension age. The French are not taking it. There's more protests. Again, millions out on the street again this week and striking against a two-year rise in the pension rate itself. And again, as typical with Parisian protests, a little bit of trouble towards the end. We just have an image here, actually, of the crowds on the street in Paris. We also have a video of a little bit of trouble that occurred towards the end of that. There have also been protests in Israel against the extremist Zionist coalition that has formed, and it's been doing some terrible things, from massively extending their settler programs, essentially confiscating and stealing Palestinian lands and family homes, beating the Palestinian people. This is ongoing, but they've also extended attacks outwards, attacks on Iran, attacks on Syria, and Israel seems to be out of control. But there have been protests growing on the streets against this extreme radical government and judicial reforms that they're trying to implement. That was video from Israel of recent protests, which do seem to be growing. Padraig, in terms of the protests in Paris, protests in Israel, it is positive and good to see that there is domestic resistance to all these kind of things.
It is encouraging to see that, and I think people sometimes can be ambivalent to what the actual impact and positivity that comes out of mass people protests. What it certainly does is that it shows an opposition. And that's very important. If people think that doesn't necessarily drive policy changes, they're probably right. But you must show that there's an opposition to things, and it is encouraging that people do that. What I worry about is once there is a mass gathering of a movement of people on an issue, that inevitably then there is attempts to divide that, and that people need to probably learn to be more resilient to that, because it's always been the case. They break down people power whenever they can. So we've got to become more mature on these things and be resistant to it, because it's people power that's going to change things.
And something that might impact people and annoy people more than international stories might be domestic stories about their cars. You want to cover our final story tonight, which is about potential bans on cars into the future.
Yes, the Irish Times covered this. So coalition tensions are growing over plans to reduce private car usage, with ministers set to discuss a new strategy this week. Green Party Minister Eamon Ryan is expected to bring a memo to Cabinet that will include an annex to the government's climate plan setting out how and when climate measures can be achieved. One aspect of this will include a commitment to develop a demand management strategy in transport, detailing the ways in which the country can move to end congestion and change the way road space is used. The plan would see priority given to public transport, cycling and walking, as part of government's aims to give people viable alternatives to use the car for every journey. It's understood the strategy will take a year to be completed and agreed, but already there are tensions within the coalition around such measures. One Fine Gael source said the suggestions are, as of now, nothing but options. Another said it is modelling, not policy. Fine Gael TD Emer Higgins said the new modelling derived from the National Transport Authority suggests a congestion charge of €10 for motorists and a 400% increase in parking charges. We've all seen the crippling effects petrol and diesel increases have had on motorists and businesses alike. Taken in the round, congestion charges and fuel increases will end up increasing consumer prices as it costs more to bring goods to city centres, she said. Our city centres are still recovering post-COVID. Any move to restrict motorists should be tied to capital investments, ensuring that motorists have tangible alternatives to use when leaving their cars at home. Any plan should focus on how we continue to prioritise improving public transport infrastructure instead of placing further pressure on motorists. Sources said that actions are being prioritised that will really move the dial on the mitigation of greenhouse gases. You can see that, you know, when these things happen, like, so you've got basically a leading heading on of car climate restrictions. Like, climate dictates so much societal change. Brought this issue up before. I'd like to see a little bit more being put out there in terms of public engagement on these issues. Don't see any. It's all diktats, and it's all based on the sacred cow of the climate. If we could probably push through anything if we said it was good for the climate, and that's an extreme worry. It doesn't necessarily be qualified. Like, people are going to end up 400% increase in parking charges. I don't know how much experience you have of driving into the city centre, but I've been in the city centre over the last few years an awful lot of times just to protest, right? Just to show my democratic will to oppose something, right? And to do that cost me €25 for being in there for 4 or 5 hours. Okay, so provide us with the public transport to do the same thing, that's fine, but I mean, it's making it, it's actually probably making the city centres off limits. I think the first week that we worked on this programme, Finbar, we talked about the burden on people bringing children into city centre hospitals. There are reasons why people need to go to city centres, and there's reasons why they need to use cars. So if you're telling me that this must be inhibited now in the future to protect the climate, and you're going to do it in such a way where it's going to cost you so much, well, let's see. What's the proof? It's the same as the other topic. Like, give us the data a little bit more. Like, people are not stupid. They need to be given the actual information and not just decrees from government.
It's more of the same, isn't it? Paternalistic diktats coming down without consultation, without proper engagement and discussion, and using science as a stick to implement it. and to argue on its behalf, when in reality, science quite often is in disagreement that we're not really being told that. That's the show for tonight, folks. Thanks for tuning in once more. Please like, share, subscribe when you can. Log on to mcompassmedia.com onto our website, where you'll get all of our stories, the stories that we maybe can't put out on social media, and the stories that we do put out on social media that you might have missed. Again, thanks for joining in, folks. It's good night from me.
And good night from me as well. Thanks, Finbar.